So it's been 3 weeks, and I still don't know what Putin wants in Ukraine. What does he want in Ukraine? At least
Babushkas.
that's what that's what I keep seeing in the headlines. You know, at least off on the side of the Western media, some Western outlet trying to encourage me to read an article that will apparently explain what is it that Putin wants in Ukraine.
I know.
Is he after the... What do they sell in Ukraine? They make good cheese there. Does he want the cheese?
The bread.
He's after their bread. They've got good bread.
Good bread.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, they're confused. It's like, well, he's trying to get a piece of Ukraine. Well, he's got 2 pieces already, but it looks like he wants some more pieces.
He's hungry.
The only question is, we're not sure how many pieces of the Ukraine he wants.
Right. He's just hungry. That's all.
Yeah.
He's
Another
hungry.
classic one. I got one here, actually. I'll bring it up later. It's BBC yesterday. Getting inside Putin's head.
Yeah.
It's like, but they had pieces, not just a recent thing, they've had pieces like that for years in Western media. Like,
let's get inside his head.
What is going on in there?
We're perfectly capable of understanding what's going on in his head, you know? I mean, we just need to try and figure it out here, you know?
Well,
it's obviously not something good, right? It's something weird. Like, what's going on in his head?
Definitely weird.
The only time you'd have to ask that question is when you're concerned about someone's mental health. What's going on in his head? There's something weird going on there, isn't there? There's something not right. Like I've heard people on Twitter, he's sick. He looks sick to me. Is he? And in that article, actually, in the BBC, we could pull it up. Actually, maybe it's. Is it on? I remember. What's driving Putin? Oh yeah, what's driving Putin? Agents seek to get inside Putin's agents. There's a whole team of agents, you know, trying to get inside Putin's head, and that may even include remotely, you know, by psychic projecting or
That's
something like that.
That's from a few years ago. There's serious stuff about using tech or remote viewers in the West to try.
The men who stare at goats.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah, they're absolutely. Well, they're not saying that in the BBC, no, Neil. That's a conspiracy theory too hard. But there it is.
Well, I'll look for something.
Western agents seek to get inside Putin's head. Interesting, actually. Seek to literally get inside Putin's head. On the evidence that this is a bullshit article by a bullshit supposed journalist called Gordon Correa, is in the 5th, 6th paragraph there. Talking, so it's all like his isolation. He's sick. He's not good, you know. So anyway, his isolation has been evident in pictures of his meetings, such as when he met President Emmanuel Macron, the pair at far ends of a long table. This guy obviously doesn't even read the news, right? That he's supposed to be producing, right?
Right.
Because when that picture came out soon afterwards, it was explained by the French government that the reason they were at far end of a long table was because Macron refused. He was asked to take a PCR test to see if he had the COVID, and him or his handlers or whoever, his advisors, did not want him to take a PCR test because then Putin himself would have access to Macron's DNA, and he would produce millions of Macrons or something like that. He would do something. Or
find the skeletons in his family closet.
Maybe, or he would develop an ethnic-specific weapon, a Macron-specific weapon to take him out, or some bullshit like that. So Macron wouldn't take a PCR test, wouldn't give, the theory being he wouldn't give the Russians access to his DNA, and that's why he was at the end of a far end of a table. But this bullshit journalist from the BBC, of which there are many, decided to spin that without even, apparently doesn't know that, which was an official statement by the French government, and he spun it into Putin's isolated. Did you see how far he was sitting from Macron? Macron doesn't like him. That's why he sat at the far end of the table. That's the level of bullshit that people are getting in the Western media.
Well, the more sober analysis, I'm laughing as I say that, the more sober take on it was that this might speak to the extent of the effect of COVID-19 lockdown and isolation has had on Putin over the last 2 years, that he's paranoid about his health. And on the surface, that would be simply that he is among those who's particularly scared of the virus, right? But even that take isn't... Putin would know full well. Now, the thing is, there is something to be discussed about that issue, because Russia did go... At one point, Putin was wearing the full hazmat suit as he visited sick people with COVID in the hospital. You know, he went in his yellow hazmat to distinguish him from everyone else. So there were photos of full-scale biowarfare scenario in Russia and measures taken to protect the president and all that stuff. So I don't know if you want to get into this now, but there's something serious about COVID-19 that not just the Russian government, but obviously the Chinese government took as well. Joe?
They were looking at you, they're not looking at me.
Good time.
I've got a good timing going on here.
Anyway, this
I'm
is
hungry.
serious. This is serious.
I'm hungrier than Putin. I need 2 Ukraines right now.
Well, we better show him what Neely Bob was laughing at there.
Jeez, it's a lollipop. All right, get over it. God damn it, you can't even have a lollipop. Anyway, getting back to yes.
No. So the Russian explanation for that they asked Macron to take a PCR test and he wouldn't.
Yeah.
Hence the 40 feet of table.
But that exposes
Also
in
doesn't
itself the whole
sound like the whole story.
Well, it exposes the whole spooky aspect of the way governments work and how they all distrust each other and how it's in the background and has been in the background for a very long time. That they're all afraid of some kind of a specific weapon or something that someone could produce based on having access to your DNA. They take it seriously. Macron himself wouldn't do a PCR test because he didn't want to give the Russians access to his DNA. I mean, that right there blows open the whole... I mean, if you apply that to the whole COVID situation and kind of infer what that means or how these people think as a matter of course about bioweapons and all that kind of stuff and genes and DNA and modification of viruses and different pathogens and stuff, it's just par for the course for them, right?
They take it very seriously.
But for the rest of the world, it was complete nonsense. What? Made in a lab? Virus made in a lab? Nobody does that. It's like people are so ignorant like about how the world actually works. It's ridiculous. And there's no justification for it. There's no excuse for it because all the information is available to people, but they don't want to look at it, you know. They want to live in rosy, smiley, happy unicorn bunny land, you know. And you can live in that for a little while, but you should pay attention to how the world actually works whenever you come out of, you know, rainbow unicorn land. So, yeah, you said China and Russia took it seriously.
Yeah.
And other countries obviously took it seriously. And just a little update on that. We've said this before. And I said it ages ago, actually, probably like almost 2 years ago, that when this first came out, the strongest evidence, at least circumstantial evidence, in the absence of actual hard evidence, which is available somewhere, that this virus was made in this COVID virus, SARS-CoV-2, was made in a lab deliberately and released, almost undoubtedly released deliberately. In the absence of that hard evidence, the strongest evidence that this was made in a lab was seen in the initial response of governments to the news, particularly that came out of China, because that's where it was dropped in China. Chinese had first access to it, had a look at it, immediately knew by looking at it, because you know when you look at a virus that whether it's of natural origin or whether it's being tweaked. They saw that it was tweaked and they activated their bio-warfare protocols. There's no time to wait and see what happens. You do it now. That spread then. The rest of the world, governments in the rest of the world got spooked, especially in Europe. Saw them doing that, took the Chinese at their word that this was serious, that it was made in a lab. And you saw in Italy, you saw the military coming in, because bio-warfare protocols of any government is military. It's the military that takes care of it. It's not the government. It's not the civilian government. It's the military. They go in their hazmat suits with their decontamination protocols, and they remove bodies. And that's precisely what they did in Italy, if you remember, in late March and early April last year. It had served to freak out the population. And nobody asked the question at the time, why is the Italian government sending the military in to remove bodies?
Right.
And
why did the Russians send in military biowarfare experts to northern Italy?
Right.
In early March,
right.
2020.
To investigate. Yeah.
Well, let me just...
For me, that blows open the whole thing that it was made in a lab.
Was there then justification, albeit for a different reason, for the severe clampdown on public discussion?
Yeah, for sure.
Of the seriousness of COVID-19, of its existence at all, to start with, of its seriousness, and then of the measures to contain it.
Was that the reason for the what?
Is there then justification for the kinds of clampdown on public discussion of this?
No.
No.
Why?
Well, if
You should have more public
if it's
discussion.
DEFCON 5 on biowarfare situation,
Yeah. Then you tell everybody. You don't hide it from them.
in the absence of that, though, because governments maybe they have a paternalistic view of the world, and they see rightly as people as children in many cases.
Okay. So from that perspective,
Are
let's
they
say,
not going to go
let's pretend this is just a normal virus.
weak? Yeah.
Well, I would say, yeah. I mean, you can go with the paternalistic thing, but given that most of the people who were putting the lockdown on discussion about it and censoring people on social media, talking about the origins and what was really going on here, that came from the West. And this virus most likely came from the West, was made in a Western lab, probably in Fort Detrick in the US, and dropped on China's doorstep. Now, the primary motivation for people in the West doing that is not so much about not spooking the population. That's maybe a secondary consideration. The first consideration is not revealing, not letting out the idea or starting the ball rolling on public awareness and public discussion of this definitely came from a lab. Okay, which lab did it come from? Who did it? And why did you release it? That's your motivation for not wanting discussion on it.
Right. Okay. So they
And also
they did lift the barrier to that last summer, but only in the context
Of
of
China
it
did
being
it.
China doing
Yeah,
it.
of course, yeah.
Right.
Anyway, so that's just on that small point.
The topic of today's show is Russia, China, the New World Order. That's a hell of a
Yeah.
statement. Do you want to do a quick sit rep on Ukraine?
Do you not like the New World Order?
Well, no. No one likes the New World Order, right? No one who's a dissident. in
It's
the
a bad
West.
word.
It's a bad word.
It's a bad term.
Well, as I explained in the blurb of the show, there are two overlapping conceptions of it. On the one hand, you've got George H.W. Bush, 1991 speech to State of the Union after the collapse of the USSR, in which he declares a new world order. Obviously the American establishment has a vision of it where it's the unipolar moment. There's no one but us. And then they go on, as you've explained in recent shows, to publish papers on rebuilding America's defenses and preventing any peer competitor from ever rising to challenge us now that we have this
Yeah.
apparent open field
I'll
for
give you
total supremacy.
another quote of hubris just on that line. President Bush's second inaugural address when he was re-elected in 2000, after he was re-elected in 2005, at the height of the Iraq War, said, "It is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nature and culture, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world."
Ending tyranny.
Seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nature and culture in the world.
Right. It's a total vision, very much a totalizing vision.
We are going to rule the world, and
Our
everybody.
values are universal, and what we define as tyranny, most importantly, is what is tyranny, the dictionary definition for all languages.
And everybody must toe the line,
Yeah.
or you're in trouble.
Now, that's the predominant establishment, New World Order, i.e. a good thing, a good conception, something we should all share. The whole world will eventually share if we get our way. Then there's an important distinction to be made where New World Order was a byword in dissident Western opinion for the overarching conspiracy theory of, namely, that U.S. establishment, but not necessarily U.S. per se, a global clique, globalists,
Because that's
Davos set, etc., envisioning that total vision for the world, not America ruling supreme per se, but this internationalist clique.
Yeah,
Davos set.
America being the point of the tip of the spear, basically, and for enforcing it. Certainly, it was going to be under an American mandate, basically. The rest of the
although
world.
the main dissident framing of it was from the 1960s forward, from the John Birch Society all the way up to, what was his name? Oh, Tex Mars. Among other famous sort of 70s, 80s conspiracy theory writers, who then gave rise to Alex Jones, who directly was kind of an apostle of these guys, where it's the UN that's the tip of the spear.
Well, that was their best guess for a globalist. The easiest go-to thing for a kind of global organization, right? Was the UN. The UN's global, so it's going to be the UN.
Yeah.
But it's not.
Today it's slightly different. It's the WEF.
The WEF,
With
Davos.
reasonable grounds for saying that because of the incredible amount of statements from world leaders
Yeah.
and
What's
Schwab
clear,
and-
whether it's the
and others.
Bilderbergers, as it used to be, or
Yeah.
the Davos set, or the
Trilateral Commission.
or the Council of Foreign Relations, or the WEF, or whatever, or just America, or some. There's obviously a group of people somewhere with those ideas, and they've been pushing them under different names, basically, like we just described, for the past 20 or 30 years or more. And yeah, they're kind of like, they seem to be a transnational kind of group of people, or they're globalists, as Alex Jones likes to call them. The globalists are out to get us. These are people who see the world as, their oyster, and they're gonna rule it and control it. And yeah.
what
Well, Lavrov actually, I think it was yesterday or the day before, he gave a talk to RT. You can't really see RT videos very easily anymore, although they're on the RT website, but they usually be on YouTube, but they're not allowed to be on YouTube anymore. So it was on a Telegram channel, I saw it, where RT basically in English, and the whole interview was in English for 30 minutes, and he described it as that the US was planning to, manifest the American experiment around the world, basically. Like America as the melting pot, he described it, as it likes to, in a
Right.
positive way, it likes to describe itself as a melting pot of all cultures, whatever.
bring all your
and all of them
we
together.
are shelter for all of the Statue of Liberty.
Under wonderful
yeah.
American values and all that kind of stuff, that it's clear to him, and has been clear to him in the Russian government for a long time, that the plan was that this melting pot idea that is exemplified by the US, in the US, has been in the process of being rolled out around the world. And he said, and of course with them doing the melting.
It's a good way of putting it.
Yeah.
And of course, that naturally seamlessly incorporates the transhumanist melting pot, where Klaus Schwab's like practical orgasms when he's speaking about the implants in the brain. Oh, he's there giving talks like rich Arabs in Dubai. Oh, it's the future of the nanobots and the implants in your brain. Oh, and he thinks they're all on with them.
Yeah, yeah.
Now Schwab obviously not American, but it's the kind of it's the merger. Kissinger probably, is he still alive? He's probably into that too. The transhumanists. We'll transcend everything, and it'll be all one melting pot with technology, one nation. Mass migration doesn't matter. In fact, let's encourage it, because we'll quickly break down those anachronistic traditional values.
Nationalism.
Yeah,
Yeah, national
i.e.
identity.
the natural bonds that people feel
That separate people
with their
as
local
well.
community.
With their own community. That separate them from other people, but not in an exclusionary way, let's say. But, everybody with their own identity, and obviously that those identities exist, and them cooperating in the ways that they can, but nobody being subsumed into one, like Lavrov said, a melting pot, and then everybody with a monoculture and mono values, basically, that are imposed by someone back in Washington, D.C. or wherever they are.
So this is the nominal New World Order that
That
a group or groups are desperately trying to make a real fact on the ground
Have
the
been,
world
yeah.
over. Have been to some extent. Well, I suppose what we would describe as a counter. Yeah, it is a counter moving. It's a different movement of history that has emerged in recent years. Is a alternative version concept of a new world order that is indeed being imposed by groups, I suppose, but impose is probably the wrong word. It seems to be a natural function of resistance to this kind of total imperialism, this total view of the world with one set of values, one civilization.
Well, it's important.
Under
It's important to explain that the New World Order, as envisioned by America, was started quite a long time ago, and the first thing you got to do is you got to control as much of the world as possible, economically, militarily, then spread your culture through your. It goes with conquest. Economic conquest includes products. Products that are tied to culture: Coca-Cola, McDonald's, all that kind of stuff.
And communications.
Communications, getting your broadcast media across as much of the world as possible.
Building the internet.
And your values, and your values and all that kind of stuff, freedom and democracy, fighting terrorism, all that kind of stuff. So you start with that and you roll that out as much as possible. And then you start, once you've got that far, then you start to, you start to see it in more maybe more insidious, more subtle, more personal values amongst the population of the countries of the rest of the world. So your plan is a homogenization of the world along your cultural value lines, and of course, the cultural values that are promoted by the current, or not the current, but the establishment in Washington that's been there for quite a long time and transcends administrations, isn't very positive. It's, well, if you want to know what it is, it stands in direct opposition to conservative values in America, as we've seen. So whatever the opposite of traditional conservative Christian values in America are, that's what they stand for. Transgenderism, all that kind of stuff, and that even extends to kind of like transhumanism and all that kind of stuff. So it's all trans something, right? Everything's trans.
Yeah.
So it's not good from the average person's point of view, you know what I mean? Because the vast majority of people have grown and lived up in countries where they have a national identity, they have national values and cultural values, that are particular to them, but that are also shared in a general way with a lot of other countries. But those are the things that are being eroded and have been being eroded. Consider the attack on populism that started when, 5, 6, I don't know how many years ago, 5, 6 years ago. Populism became a bad word. And populism is nothing more than what the majority of the people in that country want. The ones who have strong values, who feel strongly about something and want to defend it and want to stand up for it and want those values to be represented for them by government, that's populism. That's very, very bad. Trump, he was populist, terrible. Conservative Christian,
Yeah.
the values that people have lived by and lived with for centuries are extremely bad.
Yeah,
according to these people.
It's interesting that they frame it always as Trump was lumped in with Xi, what's his name in Mexico? I forgot his name. AMLO is an acronym. Putin, of course, leader of Pakistan and so on. The interesting thing is that they really do feel, I think they're sincere in their statements, that they feel that this is tyrannical. This is the rise of authoritarianism of all these leaders and the populist movement behind them. For the people who are trying to transcend the world away from this, they conceive it as tyrannical because it's a stop against what they want.
But it's not tyrannical. It's what has existed, like I said, for centuries in the popular mind and popular culture in those countries, and it only started to be pushed because of the attack on it, the original attack on it to try and destroy, to try and water it down and call it evil and call it bad. Then it starts to manifest itself because it's like, no, we're trying to defend our values here that we have lived by for centuries. We're not talking about the restrictive values necessarily. People can be easily led to remove, with a bit of reasoning, to remove certain kind of cultural norms or values or attitudes that maybe were a bit racist or sexist, whatever. They can remove those, but there's a line. Okay, well, we understand that, being mean to other people or being mean to other cultures or other races or whatever is bad. Okay, if that was part of our history, okay, we'll stop it. But there's far more to our culture. That's only a small part of it. There's far more to our culture that is benign, that we're not willing to let go of. And they push back against the attempt to get rid of all of it. And then they're called tyrannical for doing that.
Yeah. The explanation you just gave is the common sense explanation. I'm telling you that when Bush said our mission is to end tyranny in 2004, his conception of tyranny is anything that would challenge what is objectively our tyranny, but of course, which we see it as bestowing flowers and peace and democracy on.
Yeah, of course. No. He saw it as that as well. At least if he was asked, that's what he said. I mean, in the quote, he said the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nature and culture, i.e., to end tyranny. So anything that's not democratic or freedom loving or whatever is tyrannical. You're reading into it like behind the kind of deeper thing, which he may ascribe to, but certainly not publicly. The public face of it was, we're spreading freedom and democracy around the world here. Anybody who's a dictator, who's abusing their people, as we decide, as we think, that's what we're trying to fix. So it had to be presented to the people in a way that was palatable, right?
Yeah, I suppose I'm thinking of Caesar here, Julius Caesar, and there are many examples between him 2,000 years ago and now. Caesar was framed in his time and for all history thereafter as an evil tyrant.
Yeah.
And the specific beef with him was that he was tyrannically imposing, as they saw it, the optimists, his opponents, his political opponents in the Roman Senate, they saw it, he's imposing his tyrannical will on us. Objectively, that wasn't what was happening. He was trying to equalize the world. He was trying to make things fair for most
Right.
people. He wasn't trying to rob the actual tyrants of their privileges, of their massive wealth. He was just trying to make it a little bit fairer. And they went freaking
Yeah.
ballistic. And he has been marked for all time after that as a tyrannical dictator, because from the point of view of his
The
political
optimists.
opponents, that is what tyranny is.
Yeah,
I
to
know it's
them,
warped,
yeah.
it's pathological, it's psychopathic,
Yeah.
but
So in this case, what you're saying is that when Bush and the rest of them all talked about spreading freedom and democracy, that's just a sop for the population. And then when he talks about the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world, from his insider Washington establishment perspective, the guys in the US sitting on high on the hog type thing and ruling the world, any opposition is tyrannical. It doesn't have to be like dictator or anything bad. They'll turn him into a dictator if they have to.
Yeah.
But it's any opposition to their unrivaled power, basically.
Yes.
Which is what we talked about previously, right?
yeah.
That
And,
no
and
challengers.
that has included throughout the 20th century, going to the extreme of if the population of a country democratically looks like it's going
To
the
support
way
a-
we don't like,
Yeah.
i.e. Mossadegh, democratically elected in Iran as prime minister, secular, all normal, would have been, you would think he would have been ideologically perfect for the Anglo-American and even the Israelis in the 1950s. No, they actually went to the point of overthrowing and installing an actual dictator so that the overall movement of that country's progress would not go in the direction of the tyranny as they saw.
And the nationalism.
Yes.
Nationalism, basically.
Yeah.
National identity, our country, our borders, our resources for us. We'll do business if we can, or on the basis that it is good for us and good for mutually beneficial, but we're not being absorbed into any monoculture or any kind of like Pax Americana or whatever. We're not doing that. We have an identity. We're separate people. We're a separate country. We're sticking with it. That's tyranny.
Yes.
To them, to people
tyr-
who want to rule the world, of course it is. Yeah.
Tyranny, in that specific instance, tyranny, and it's lasted half a century, at least 70 years now at this point. It's Arab and other Middle Eastern countries thinking that they're going to be able to govern what they do with their resources,
Yeah.
as opposed to us.
Yeah.
Because we know best.
It's a
We have a
block.
grand vision of the world. Listen, you don't understand.
We have a grand vision of the world that sees us owning it all or having significant control and power over as much of it as possible, and anything that stands in our way, i.e. nationalist ideologies or nationalist ideas, is tyrannical. Of course, they call it tyrannical because it feels bad to them. We don't like this, so let's call it a bad name, tyranny, let's call it terrorism, let's call it dictator. Yeah. So how do we get onto that? Where were we at the beginning?
Well, can you put back up that BBC article, "Getting Inside Putin's Head"? Go up just the headline. So, the press is full of this kind of stuff. Getting inside Putin's head. What's going on in there? How come we didn't see this coming? Well, we kind of did, but not as we expected. And it's been doing it for 20 years about Putin. Here's the thing. It's been in plain sight since the mid-1990s. Specifically as it concerns Putin and Russia's goals, he said it all. All his speeches have laid it out.
Mm-hmm.
His written papers have laid it out. It's so obvious. It's easy to figure out what he wants because he has said over and over what he wants.
But it doesn't make any sense to them.
It's bizarre. It's like the ideological blind spot is created from, well, that's what he's saying, but what does he really want? Now, what he's trying to achieve in Ukraine and elsewhere, Syria 5, 6, 7 years ago, it's the same thing. He says what he's going to do, then he does it.
Well, go down, scroll down to the picture of Putin and Macron, actually, because he has that in there, down at the bottom, or halfway down. There. No, next one. Or maybe further down. There you go. there's the Putin isolated because Macron was too scared to take PCR test. But just above that paragraph, another source or readouts. This is another source for how Putin is isolated and crazy. Another source are readouts from those who have had direct contact, such as other leaders. In 2014, Angela Merkel reportedly told President Obama that Mr. Putin was living in another world. I don't doubt he was.
Right.
Just one that Angela couldn't understand.
Yeah.
And it's coming to fruition in a certain sense. So the first steps towards that other world are starting now.
Yeah. Yeah, this speaks exactly to what I'm trying to say. He hasn't hidden. He's elaborated very
He
explicitly.
made it very clear to Angela, obviously.
Well, she can't understand it.
Well, he made it clear to her, but she couldn't understand it, yeah.
She couldn't understand because ideological blinkers are in place. And this affects almost all Western leaders. You occasionally get a candidate for an election in the West who gets it, wants to be closer to Russia, talks about multipolar world.
And they get excoriated for it.
Yeah, and they simply don't make it. They don't get into anywhere. I think not Putin, but Trump had a good idea, and he broke the mold by actually getting into power. But then we saw the incredible difficulty he had.
Do you remember Orban?
Orban gets it.
But do you remember what he was called by? Who was it? Was that half-drunk?
Juncker.
Juncker, the EU president. He jokingly, he's on tape at one of the meetings on tape saying, "Oh, here comes the dictator."
Here comes the dictator.
And he said it jokingly.
Yeah.
And Orban heard him, obviously, and he was joking, and it was all a good laugh. But that exposes their attitude. Orban is a nationalistic-minded kind of leader of Hungary, and Hungary is a country where people are, just more resistant, like Serbia, more resistant to this whole Pax Americana, monoculture, Coca-Cola, and do what we say or else type attitude,
Yeah.
So you're a dictator. Jokingly sometimes, but sometimes seriously. Like now with Putin, he's a real dictator.
Yeah.
Orban's just a kind of jokey dictator.
Samuel Huntington. We've discussed him over the years.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're a bit guilty of it too. Most people misunderstood the point, his core point that he was making. So in early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama, I forgot his name.
Fukuyama.
Italian, Japanese American academic, writes the famous paper, The End of History,
Mm-hmm.
in which he says, here we are now, the USSR has collapsed, the ideological Cold War is over. We are now in a time where clearly market forces have won, neoliberalism will spread, liberal democracy will spread too everywhere, and that's what he meant by the end of history. There is no more great struggle. This is basically it. The world has made the phase shift into, I'm not sure if he used the term, but it can be probably expected that he said, it can be imputed to him. Here we are now, we have just made the phase shift into the New World Order. Now, Samuel Huntington came along not long after, in a paper in 1993. It became a book in 1999, but in his paper of 1993, it was called The Clash of Civilizations. Now, all he meant by that was a kind of realpolitik, roughly conservative answer back to the more liberally universal-minded academics like Francis, to say that, history, the end of history, are you sure about that? There are other cultures out there, and they haven't had different
chance, really.
conceptions of how things are. Now, in his book, the cover of the book, the original book cover, you've got the crucifix of Christianity, the crescent moon and star of Islam, and the yin-yang symbol representing the East. And that spoke to the fact that he was thinking of at least three. In fact, he also includes a map. There are more like 7, roughly speaking, civilizational areas. One of them is Russia and the former USSR, North America, MENA, the Middle East, North Africa, and so on. Then, of course, the West and South Asia with India. Anyway, he published his book in 1999. Because of what happened on 9/11, that quickly got vectored. The lens that Huntington was trying to convey was vectored into just seeing two, namely the globalizing West and this new horrible global threat of Islamic terrorism. I say vectored because 9/11 warped the kind of more objective picture that the hunting was trying to create from that debate in the 1990s. It warped everything. It obscured it because the way I think of it is like the Islamic threat was essentially manufactured. And it was the only clash of civilizations, just those two, so to speak, that the Western unipolar Washington and London crowd wanted the world to see. And it was, I'm not suggesting they consciously did this, but what it had the effect of doing was obscuring, blowing smoke over the actual underlying clash of civilizations underneath. It only showed the clash between two, so to speak, but there are other considerations to take into. They probably did it with ease because they'd ruled out Russia ever being a threat at any.
But it's not a clash, it's not a clash of civilizations. It's a clash of ideologies.
Yeah, although Huntington said it was a clash of cultures.
Same thing.
Okay.
Really same thing. But again, are there any? I mean, this is if the underlying clash of cultures or clash of civilizations or clash of ideologies or whatever is today. What are you saying? It's the West versus what the real one is the West versus Russia and China or Eastern country cultures, right? That's basically what you're saying, right?
Yes, yes, it is.
I mean, most notably, well, let's say at least Russia now, right?
Yeah.
But what is it? Are there serious differences in terms of outlook at a basic level, like a foundational level? Are there serious issues in worldview between the average American and the average Russian?
No.
So it's
I don't
not a
think
clash
so.
of cultures then, or civilizations. That's what I'm saying. It's a clash of ideologies that's being opposed from the top, and there is a clash, but it's the ideology within the Washington establishment of them, that small clique ruling the world and having everybody else subservient, versus other countries in the world, most notably Russia and China and a few others, who are saying, no, we don't agree with you ruling the world because that implies that you would be ruling over us, which we've just talked about.
But here's the $64,000 question. Would any other culture produce a mindset that thinks like that?
Things like,
Is there any history
I mean,
of China ever being the hegemon before? Or Russia being
No,
the hegemon?
no.
Or Africa?
But who is producing that? Who is it that's producing? I mean, are you saying that the culture produced this, or
Yes.
like the Western, the whitey culture? So it's there's something wrong with whitey. We're back to there's something wrong with whitey, or are we dealing with something more fundamental here in terms of just like the word we have used a lot in over the years, psychopathy or psychopathy?
Okay. And then
But is that produced? Okay, it ties itself to certain cultures that are maybe cultures of excess, of extreme, material gratification, let's say, which is, centered in the US. Let's say the US is capitalism and, 24-hour shopping, 24-hour everything, you can be the president. It's very materialistic compared to a lot of countries and cultures around the world, yeah. So maybe it selects for psychopathy in terms of them being more preponderant there being a higher number of psychopathic type, or that mentality, whatever you want to call it, extreme service to self, extreme selfish, an extremely selfish viewpoint and self-serving viewpoint in the upper echelons of power compared to other countries. It's hard to tease it out, but I think if you bring it back down to the average, I wouldn't put all that then on the American people and the average American, let's say, and the kind of values that they, when really asked, the values that they would espouse. I think there'd be more commonality between them and most other people around the world, and that in truth, the true values that have been covered up or forced down, the true values that most Americans, let's say, hold to, are certainly not the values of their political elite. That the difference is there, as opposed to between Russians and Americans, it's between the American people and their political elite. If you have to call it one way or the other, you know what I mean?
yeah.
Because otherwise you're kind of like, you're tarring in a certain sense,
No,
At
no.
least in case of America, you're a
there's-
whole culture and 330 million people, you know.
There's a struggle.
Yeah.
There's clearly a struggle. Look at the extreme polarization in United States politics
Yeah, for sure.
at the moment.
But that's an example of what I'm saying.
It's a struggle.
There's a lot of people, and probably a majority of people, supported Trump, not because he was Trump, but because what he stood for. And it wasn't even that good what he stood for, if you know what I mean. But it was
Yeah.
at least it was something compared to what was being offered them by the Washington establishment.
Okay, so then you lean towards being a certain clique of people. And where does that originate in the United States? Well, most likely
English.
in its English origins.
Protestant.
Because who is the West today? All of them
Anglo-America.
are English colonial outposts,
It's Anglo-America.
with some Northwestern European
Yeah.
allies closely stitched on.
Thrown
The
in there.
Germans are kind of in there, but Germany could switch first, actually, in the coming years, to dropping out of this. Germany and or France, but anyway, that remains to be seen. For now, they're all in lockstep.
Yeah,
But that
'Cause they've
international
sold their
community
souls.
is so small.
it is, yeah.
Yeah, you're right, and it doesn't have popular support. That's why there's a massive
But people are
attempt to clamp
incessant.
down on dissent in the West.
Yeah, and they're incessantly lied to and manipulated by this clique in power, you know, because they know they have to keep them on side, keep them stupid. And by keeping them on side, by keeping them on side, that means keeping them stupid, keeping them dumbed down, misinformed, disinformed.
Yeah. And they also have to lie to them about what their grand vision is for the world.
Of course, you have to. It's freedom and democracy.
That's like Putin's been educating all of us since at least 2007 with his Munich speech, when he used the term unipolarity and compared it to multipolarity. I think the origin of that distinction, of that concept, a counter concept, multipolarity, is super interesting. I want to share something here. I've just sent it to you, Scotty. This is, hopefully we'll just be able to see the abstract. We don't need to see this whole paper, but it was written in 2009. It's on JSTOR by Susan Turner. Not sure who she is. I think she's an American academic. The title of the paper is Russia, China, and a Multipolar World Order. Can you enlarge the abstract so we can read it? Okay.
Not
Too
that
much. It was published in 2009, but that's not what interests us. Look how far back this literature goes. Since the late 1990s, the concept of multipolarity has gained prominence around the globe. Russia and China in particular have repeatedly agreed on this term, ill-defined as it was maybe, and subsequently have included it or alluded to it in nearly all of their joint declarations, statements, and treaties, dating from the mid-1990s to the present.
Fell on deaf ears.
At a time when American hegemony is declining, although maybe her peers in academia would have agreed with that, no one in Washington did in 2009. At a time when American hegemony is declining and speculation abounds as to, look, this is interesting, as to which among the world's burgeoning nations will rise to power. That's an interesting thing, because even Susan Turner, in her, bless her, attempts to be objective about what's going on out there in the world, has this Western assumption that a hegemon
Yeah.
will rise to
It's
supplant
the, it's,
it.
it's the only way.
Anyway, will rise to power. It's important to examine, indeed, the renewed Sino-Russian relationship and one of its foundational pillars, the promotion of multipolarity.
It deconstructs the definition of multipolarity and applies as it applies uniquely to Russia and China in an effort to determine the depth of the two countries' agreement. Wow, they were concerned back then, yeah. Though the two may agree upon the same solution to the next world order, China and Russia employ very different strategies to achieve it. Yeah, well, that was in the what was she writing that in the 1990s?
2009.
Okay. So she's harkened back to the 1990s. Well, it's kind of true that in the 1990s, it's, as you said, that the prominence... at a time when American hegemony is declining and speculation abounds. American hegemony was declining for about 7 or 8 years during the 1990s, you know, because the Cold War was all about American hegemony. They were thwarted, they were blocked from achieving it. But as soon as the Soviet Union went away, they immediately, as we know, set on a path to projecting America's power, you know.
Full spectrum dominance.
Right. Project for a New American Century. We need a galvanizing event that will allow us to project American power into the strategic parts of the world.
Forward
i.e.
operating bases.
Eurasia, Afghanistan, Iraq,
Yeah.
oil, block against Russia, China, all of that. I mean, they didn't wait very long with their declining
And
hegemony.
they used deceptive language. They hoodwinked the American people and European people into going along with it. So, for example, when it came time to dismembering and balkanizing Yugoslavia, they didn't like publicly cite, oh, look, rebuilding America's defenses. So we need a forward operating base in Serbia or near Serbia, see? So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and blow the hell out of Belgrade and then we'll have it.
And
Of
we'll
course
break-
not.
break it
They
up.
invented a whole story in which they got people to go, oh my God, those poor Bosnian Muslims are being slaughtered by the Serbs. And
Right.
everyone, you know, waved the flag like
Got the
Ukraine
feels out,
today,
yeah.
got the feels out. And that's how, so you're right. The ordinary people, if given the actual, well, here's what we're trying to do, would not go along
No.
with this whole unipolar project. And if it was explicitly explained to them as such that, well, look, here's the thing. The world's a jungle, and we feel that really we're the only people who are fit enough to govern the entire planet. So why don't you all keep paying your taxes to us, and we will be the hegemon. We'll make sure that you know, get lots of the spoils from our mission to civilize the entire planet.
Yeah.
Of course, they never speak in that language to their own people. They must deceive them at every point. So, point taken. That's how. Still, I wonder how a country, a culture, produces, like, as if it's normal and acceptable to lie, cheat, and steal, as your man said, Pompeo about the CIA, as a whole frickin' way of being in the world. Like, and contrast that with the Russians and Chinese and others. They sit down as academics, and I'm sure some government people met up as well in the 1990s. China still has not taken off yet, but they're sitting down and they're talking and they're publishing papers so everyone can read them.
Talking about multipolarity, which is basically
How about a multipolar world? Well, what would it mean? Okay,
It's
it would mean that no
ill-defined,
one
Ian.
gets to dominate others.
What do you mean? That's ill-defined.
It means we'd all have, you know, more or less a share of the spoils.
I'm
of
not
things.
getting you. That's ill-defined. To me.
Would mean, well, how would we go? And off they go on their papers, and they publicly refer to them as in every single Russian-Chinese joint statement since the mid-1990s. They refer to it. So it's on the sleeve. There's no deception. There's no surprise. What's going on inside Putin's head? I have no idea.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
It's obvious what's going on. He keeps on saying what's going on.
10,000 times
Yep.
since the 90s.
But they don't want to listen to it. They don't want to believe it. They don't like that idea. Like, and that's where the whole, like, in the terms of it being psychopathy in power and positions of power in the West, and it filtering down, which is the term polarization or the psychopathologization of the population, where they absorb that kind of that ideology of the West is best, and we to the point that they can't conceive of any other type of world, even though it's like you'd think they should be able to understand it because it's very simple. It's whenever you know at a picnic, we all share the picnic. You know that idea? That's what we're talking about. Yeah, well, sure, I go for a picnic and I share my sandwiches with people. Yeah, I understand that. Yeah. Well, just expand that out to the world. Do you get it?
I know.
No, it's ill-defined.
No.
I don't understand what you're talking about.
Here's an article. Op-ed in the British Telegraph, March 11th, so last week. Oh, it's just, I just pulled it out because it's typical of Western thinking on this. Headline: The Free West is in danger of forgetting why it has always triumphed over dictatorships. The byline: China and Russia can offer no viable alternative to the modern world we have created. We should take confidence from that fact.
The modern world we have created where there's haves and have-nots.
He really believes that.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. That's an example of polarization. That guy, the funny guy there in the picture with his old wrinkly head, he's polarized.
He's polarized. He's overcome. He's taken over by evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Evil ideology and anti-human. Well, just let's not say anti-human. It's supremely self-absorbed. An ideology that's supremely self-absorbed and only sees what the self wants to see. Can't see anything beyond the self. And from his point of view, the self is the West expanded out to
Yeah.
everything that the West represents, and he, as a constituent member of the West, he has to support it all, and that's all he can see.
Scroll down to the fourth last paragraph, and we'll get it in his own words, the world as he sees it. Beginning with led first by Britain and more recently by the United States, the West made the modern world. As always, with great changes, some of this was the result of explicit ideas of liberty and law and the need for institutions to defend them. See the U.S. Constitution. I agree. The U.S. Constitution was the seminal moment in lawmaking for any group of people anywhere on the planet. But much grew up more incrementally and less self-consciously, which is a very important point. Did they intentionally do it, or did they happen to be on while... Well, he says the growth of trade or the power of the Royal Navy, the Industrial Revolution. He says the phrase the Industrial Revolution was invented 80 years after the fact. While it was happening, no one was claiming, oh, I did that. It was something that was happening organically, so to speak, in the world, and happened to be centered on, for a variety of reasons, Anglo-America. Well, Europe first, then the Americans.
Yeah.
And then the next one is diluted. Although the Western modern world, you see, now he has to make a distinction. We created the modern world. Oh, well, actually, there's a Western modern world because I must tacitly acknowledge that most of the other rest of the world is also modern.
The Eastern modern world.
We're almost continuously tested and often make bad mistakes. We continue to win. Even the Chinese assault on this model.
On its model.
On its model. Is not something that the non-Chinese world wants. That's not true. See Africa, for example.
Yeah.
See Central Asia, for example. We want Silk Road. Yeah, give us new Silk Roads, please.
As for Putin's Russia, it offers no viable alternative at all. Only the cry of rage that comes from repeated failure. That's just bullshit. I mean, there's so much of that nonsense coming out of the West. It's just pure. It's supremely myopic and self-focused, self-centered. It's not even worth commenting on, because that kind of crap is just repeated over and over and over again, and has been for many years, and it's just been ramped up to extreme levels in the past few weeks because of Ukraine. But there's one thing about, let's get off this for a minute because we're going on too long on that particular topic, but on it, well, it's pretty much the same topic. The US, in its attempts to control the world, as I've said repeatedly, Europe was extremely important. It's where they came from, and it's very resource rich and population dense. It's basically, they had to hold on to Western Europe. In doing that, and particularly in the last 20, 30 years, or whatever, they have basically, in their zeal to rule the world, they also want to rule their friends and their allies, right? And that's why you have NATO, and that's why America leads NATO, and that's why countries in Europe, for the most part, particularly those who are members of NATO, but others also, are like children to America, the American daddy, right? They've basically sold their souls to America under all sorts of American kind of pressure, manipulation, and blackmail and whatever. America basically took over Europe to the point that at least Western Europe and the NATO nations have no say. They have to ask America what to do. America dictates to them what they do. Yeah. America has been dictating for quite a long time to Germany what its energy needs are.
Yeah.
What for its people. What the German government should do about energy for the people, i.e. electricity, gas, whatever, keeping the country running, keeping food on the table. America decides for Germany. And it decided recently that you don't need Nord Stream. Cut it off. And they cut it off.
Merkel apparently would listen to you like with total doofus face. She'd be like, what are you talking about?
It's pure subservience.
She wouldn't understand you.
Germany does not have any military to speak of anymore.
Yeah.
Because NATO, right? And what's NATO? NATO's America. America takes care of all of it tells us what to do. It tells us when we should buy things. It tells us when we should sell things. And it tells us it tells us that it'll defend us and we don't need a military. And Germany, basically, I don't have the article here, but I was reading the other day, the head of the German armed forces said, listen, our military is in no shape to do anything. We couldn't literally defend our back garden, never mind anywhere else right now. So, but the interesting thing in that is that having effectively neutered most of Europe at this point, particularly at this point, it's got to the point where most of Europe is neutered militarily in terms of any power. It's plays second fiddle all the time to America because America likes it that way. It likes to have countries subservient to it. Russia then does what it has done in Ukraine, and America finds itself in a bind because European countries feel completely powerless to do anything because they're entirely dependent on America and have been for quite a long time under the aegis of NATO. But America's way over, all America's forces are way over the other side of the world, you know? I mean, it's interesting. There was
That's why they were so scared of Trump, European leaders.
Yeah.
Like, no,
going to
don't.
take NATO away from us. Put up that BBC one I just sent you because it actually kind of spells this out. At least there's a little bit of perspicacity in some of the Western media reporting. The one I just sent you before, Neil. I sent it to you.
What's the title?
BBC. Don't know the title. I'll send it to you again. There you go. This one is kind of shows a little bit of understanding, a little bit. There's a few people with a little bit of awareness. War in Ukraine, America is learning the art of humility. And this author, whoever it is, Catty K, says that's a good thing for the rest of the world. But there's an interesting point here. It's somewhere. Let me see down whether. Yeah, just down below the picture. The second picture. It says, well, whether it was the lesson of Afghanistan or the nature of this particularly difficult catastrophe, we don't know. But the White House has handled this crisis very differently. From the start, it has consulted with its allies, many of whom were skeptical. There are reports that US diplomats approached Europeans as equals, not subordinates.
Wow.
The administration shared highly secret intelligence in a manner that was unprecedented. In the months that led up to the invasion, senior White House officials made multiple trips to meet their European counterparts. President Biden made regular phone calls to European leaders.
Well, wonders never cease.
This wasn't Iraq in 2002. It wasn't Trump's America first. It wasn't Afghanistan in 2021. This was genuine alliance building. So America basically shit its pants because it feels that it now needs to rely on the countries to do something, to have some balls. Even though I just neutered you last week, it's like asking your dog that you just neutered last week to have some balls and man up, you know. And it's interesting that this came along at this time where the Russians chose this particular time. I mean, certainly in their estimation, obviously there was a progression anyway in terms of technological advancement and all that kind of stuff, military advancement. But it's interesting that it came at quite a good time for Russia, to actually take this action in Ukraine because, they're feckless. NATO is a sham. NATO is a military alliance in name only. It's America that has the military capacity and is willing to do anything with it. And if America doesn't want to do it, if America can't do it, then the NATO countries are useless. The rest of the NATO countries aren't going to do anything,
There are 2 points I want to make about this. Biden White House gets to look better such that this British reporter takes notice of it. Wow, they're behaving pretty good. Because they're confident that they've done everything they can to prevent any kind of genuine populist party from coming to power in Europe at this in the years ahead, as we saw in the last decade, at this key time. So they're confident that the elites in Europe will shit their pants and look to them for help anyway. So that's the first thing. They don't need anymore. When they're reading Angela Merkel's personal SMSs, and she goes, "Yeah, I'm fine with that." It's all good. It's all locked in. That's the first point. The second point is America gets to look halfway decent by not acting like a bull in a china shop when Russia launches, because America cannot do anything to stop Russia. And Russia just underscored the point this week by firing Kinjal missiles at Ukraine. The first use of hypersonic weapons in warfare that America does not have any means of countering. So what I'm getting is the only reason they can behave
This is this is what you were just referring to.
I don't think it was actually, but
It was, yeah.
I'll explain why in a sec.
Why?
It's first of all, there's no snow on the ground in Western Ukraine. Secondly, the Russians themselves have said that was a precise artillery strike. If it was a Kinjal strike, the ground around it would have shown shockwaves. It would have obliterated the actual structure of the ground for about 100 meters all around. A Kinjal missile is fired at the speed of some meteors.
Well,
There's no video of it
10 times
yet
the
of
speed
its
of sound.
impact, but this is something else. This thing goes up and down and evades all. It cannot be shot down. It cannot be even properly detected, and then it wastes everything. The reason they used it ostensibly was to hit an underground. I suppose it's what the Americans showed off in 1991 first. We've got bunker buster missiles. You know, they can go pound all the way down and blow things up. Well, Kinjal can do that on a whole other level. That's and what I was saying was America doesn't have that weaponry. It does not have a functional hypersonic missile. It doesn't have air defense system to cope with that. Russia declared that in 2018. I think Putin was hoping, y'all will listen to us now, won't you? And they didn't. They kind of took it seriously, but they weren't sure. Now it's not a bluff. You know they have the weapons and you know they have no means of stopping it. What Russia understands, and what this reporter, bless her heart, does not understand, that the United States government and or the globalist clique who wields the power through the United States responds to only one thing. The only thing they know, the only thing they project onto everyone else. Anyway, so Russia called us bluff. Power. Pure force. This has been the way since the 1500s when the West first, Europe first went out there. Power rules, the stick rules. Everyone else has learned that lesson really hard and really slow, but they've learned it. Everyone else, I mean, the other 6 billion people at this point on the planet, it's power that counts, military power, and also economic power. But firstly, physical force.
Well, you need the stick.
Russia is using the stick they have now, a bigger stick than America, and so America is getting in line. Hence the change in tone. That is what has happened. That is the significance of this moment in history.
Yeah. Yeah.
This isn't, and what's going to happen on the surface is it's going to appear, because they've no other choice, that America is going to accept this transition from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. It's going to accept, it's going to start acknowledging Moscow, this is your sphere of influence, and Beijing, this is your sphere of influence. And eventually, when it happens, India, when it modernizes completely and has 1 billion people in the middle class, and eventually behind that, if all things go well, Africa too will unite under the vision of Muammar Gaddafi, which they try to snuff out, of a united Africa, one currency, one power. So that's going to happen eventually down the road too. There's nothing they can do to stop this. This is the objective process of history. This is the real quote-unquote end of history, or the quote-unquote phase shift of history.
But this new world order then that you're talking about, but it's not going to happen easily.
No, because what's going on now, these sanctions, the US has one last card to play, and it's playing it. They're going to take a suicide pill, or rather, y'all are going to take a suicide pill. They're going to try and wreck the chessboard. Because everything is rigged. It's rigged technologically through network systems, the internet itself, which is all routed through the United States. It's rigged business-wise because the United States, the NSA, spies on everyone, has everyone's trade secrets, has everyone's, kitty fiddling secrets and all kinds of other secrets. And because the primarily most important of those three, they have the financial system rigged. Not explicitly in America, but it is the petrodollar system. It's partly rigged through Saudi petrodollars. It's partly rigged through European bond system. It's partly rigged through the Swiss banking system. They're going to pull the lever and try to bring much of the rest of the world down with them as possible. The expression that we've seen of this so far explicitly is we're going to collapse the Russian economy. The ostensible reason for it was because Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, we know that's bullshit because we sat here and we watched them say back in November last year, we've got all the sanctions lined up. We're going to cut Russia off from SWIFT. We're going to completely mutilate them. Aren't you concerned, sir, that this might backfire on us? Well, it's going to hurt the Europeans, but we're pretty confident we can fireproof the United States economy from it. They can't, but that's what they're telling people anyway. They're going to try and pull down the petrodollar system. I'm not sure if Saudi Arabia not cooperating last week with Boris Johnson when he arrived and ostensibly pled.
I'm not taking Biden's phone call either.
Yeah, but that got a lot of publication. I'm a bit suspicious of it. Everyone got to hear that Biden didn't have his phone calls answered by the Emirates of UAE and Dubai and Riyadh. But there's something, I'm not sure I trust the Saudis exactly. What it looks like on the surface that the Saudi Arabia will not increase oil supply because it's hedging its bets and or swinging to the east and joining the alliance of the rising Eurasian powers. Maybe, but there's also another darker possibility here, because when Boris Johnson went and he was mocked by his own media, whenever the British media mocks Boris Johnson, I'm always suspicious because it looks bad on the surface, but usually they just shut up and don't say anything about it. They mocked him that he did not return from Riyadh with a commitment from the Saudis to increase oil production and thereby offset the losses the West would face from Russia's oil supply no longer.
And from the sanctions, yeah. Shooting themselves in the
However,
foot. Listen, we just shot ourselves in the foot. Can you help us out?
Boris
Not
Johnson
really.
had a 2-hour conversation with MBS in Riyadh, and we've no clue what was talked about. And, you know, normally when there's a 2-hour, Jesus Christ, when Trump had a 20-minute conversation that no aides were with and no one knows what was said, the world freaked out. Well, what were they talking about, you know? Well, Bojo had a 2-hour-long conversation. So, I'm just saying that to suggest that maybe the higher goal here, the higher connivance, is that they don't mind that the Saudis, that Qatar, that the UAE make up for the lost Russian oil supply to the West because they want it to happen. They want to pull it down. This is the global economic Samson option. The system is rigged by this.
And they're imposing the Samson option because they realise that they're checkmated.
Yes.
Just before we get off the missile thing, just go to the Wikipedia page I sent you, Scotty. This is just a graphic of... and it relates to China. Maybe we can get into China here as well. If you just click on the picture on the right, just to bring it up. So this is something, it goes back to the 60s. It was originally developed in the 60s, but it basically shows... So basically the hypersonic missiles are... US doesn't really have a hypersonic missile that's fully developed. Russia does, but also China does as well. Last year, China launched a rocket, you know, that the similar rockets that they send up into space for, you know, carrying satellites or payloads, whatever. But it carried a glide, what they call a glide vehicle, and this glide vehicle circled the Earth once before coming down and obviously at hypersonic speed impacted the target. It was a bit off the target, like by 20 kilometers or something like that, but it doesn't matter because it can carry a nuclear warhead and all this kind of stuff. And apparently, you can look this up, the Americans were freaked out about this. They're on record as having said, we don't know how they did that. So they're really concerned about, and the point is that both Russia and China have offensive capabilities that make America's offensive capabilities and their defensive capabilities potentially not very useful anymore. And the interesting thing about this graph is it just shows the interesting thing is that the US, all of its missile detection radars and stuff that is stationed all across the world, obviously they're focused on the northern hemisphere against Russia and China, right? They're looking for radar, so they're pointing basically upwards, right? Upwards because they're expecting something to come over the top of the globe.
Yeah.
But if you look at the FOBS, which is a fractional orbital bombardment system, on the left there, well, there's one at the top that, so it travels, unlike traditional ICBMs that can carry nuclear warheads that go quite high in the atmosphere, up to 1,200 kilometers, and which the radars that they have are positioned to detect. These, especially the Kinzhal that the Russians have, flies at lower altitude.
Yeah.
And if you see the little graph there across FOBS going, you know, from left to right there, it reduces the amount of time that the radar has to detect it, right? Because it's flying low rather than high.
Yeah.
But the most interesting one is the one on the left where it says launch site. It goes the other way.
Around the planet.
It goes underneath. It goes over the instead of going over, they're expecting everything to go over the Arctic. This would come around over the South Pole and come in from the south, basically, and hit targets in the US from the south. Now, America has no radars specifically checking to see if there's any attacks coming from the south, because there's certainly from South of America, there's no nuclear capable country. You know, there's nukes coming from that direction. So this is something that has been released fairly recently, and especially in the context of it being hypersonic, like at 10 times the speed of sound. Even if you do have radar detection for it, it's unlikely you're going to be able to fire any missiles to stop it. So this is important in the context of what we're talking about, which is America has been checkmated in terms of its nuclear kind of threat compliance maneuver, where it basically can subtly and not so subtly threaten other countries to do what America wants it to do, or we'll nuke you. Among other blackmail tactics that they have. So so both Russia and China have this capability. It's pretty clear they have the capability, and it's why they seem to be doing what you're suggesting that they're doing, which is deciding, okay, well, listen, we can't force our will anymore, and we may just decide to pull the whole thing down if we can. But that's a big question, whether or not they can actually pull it down based on these sanctions.
And this is the Great Reset. Klaus Schwab, he's deluded. He thinks, he probably really believes this is about greening the planet and transcending the transhuman tree, blah, blah, blah. So he's kind of got this messianic vision where there's a quasi-spiritual element to it. All the objective process of history is all leading in this direction. He doesn't have an objective reading of history. That's why it's totally kooky, and most people are like, what the hell are you talking about? The Great Reset, in reality, is wiping the chessboard.
The reset of the economy, yeah.
Yeah, and it's being sold
collapse of the economy.
Being sold to people under the guise of saving the planet.
But there's
global warming.
And there's a question open as to whether or not there would be a collapse of the global economy, because the whole problem that the Russians and the Chinese have had is America's globalist ambitions. And that's, high up on the list there is their economic globalization and their control of the global economy and their control of other nations through economic measures. Now, China and Russia have been on that and been thinking about that. They've been put in place many different measures that are actually being activated right now in the face of these sanctions to kind of protect themselves or to divorce themselves to a certain extent from the Western-dominated global quote-unquote global economy. And there's a question as to whether or not in what looks to be some kind of an economic foobar coming down the pipe pretty soon as a result of the machinations of the West, whether or not everywhere east of Ukraine will,
actually do well.
Well, they won't do so badly at all. They
won't have mass famine.
Yeah.
Well, this would be the sweetest conclusion to this great story of history. I mean, this would be like enshrined in the history books after in a post-collapse world, because the sweetest part of it would be that in their ideological belief, in their wishful thinking that the globe was ours at that point in time, the West is the world, it's all one civilization, they go and pull the plug and it only collapses the West.
Yeah. It's possible, but I mean, I don't know what I'm not.
And
doing
I don't say that joyfully, because as you pointed out to me yesterday, hello Neil, you live in the West. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
But I'm not sure. I'm not doing any crystal ball stuff on what's going to happen or how bad an economic collapse or crisis, whatever you want to call it, is going to be, because there's a big part of.
But you love using your crystal ball.
There's a big. Well, here's a crystal ball aspect. Well, not really, but it's given. Looking at it from both sides. I don't think the West, despite the fact, or because of the fact that they're talking up sanctions so much and how it's going to hurt the Russian economy, behind the scenes, that there's not actually a lot really going on there, that there's less going on than people are being led to believe in terms of actual sanctions against Russia. Yes, there are some, and they've tried to do different things, but Russia has been expecting this for a long time, and it's not stupid. The Russian government aren't stupid, and Putin isn't stupid, and they've put things in place to definitely soften those sanctions or to limit the ability that the West has to actually impose sanctions. Now, there's a big thing here about Russia's foreign exchange reserves, of which there's about 600 billion, a bit less than 600.
How did half of them?
Bit less than 600 billion. Half of them are in elsewhere. That's normal, that you have your foreign exchange reserves elsewhere. It's just it's like having a bank account, because you do business or you have debts, whatever to pay in a foreign country.
Accounts.
You put it over in the country where you're paying your debts, right? It's easier. It's just a simple explanation of it. But Russia still has about a bit less than 300 billion of those foreign exchange reserves in other countries, there's a load. Most of them are in France, in the French central bank. Some are in the US. Some are in London. Some are in Tokyo, and
Switzerland.
Switzerland, and some are in China. So they spread them out with all, their major trading partners, on where they have debts to pay. Like, where basically these are countries who the debt. One of the debts, for example, is Russia sells government bonds, i.e., foreign countries, foreign entities, whatever, purchase bonds, Russian
To
government
raise
bonds.
funding for
So
loans.
they give money to Russia and buy bonds, and then they have to pay back on those. Then they can be 10-year bonds or whatever length of time. And at a certain point, you have to pay the interest on them, and it can be quite a lot, depending on how much they invest in your country. You have to pay back an interest. You agree to pay an interest on the investment that they made in your country. And those debts are coming due. And in fact, just I think yesterday or the day before, there was about 117 million was due to be paid.
A tranche.
In interest payments on government bonds to various different entities. So the question was: if Russia can't pay that, then it defaults. It's classically defaulted, right? It can't pay its
Which
debts.
the media is telling us is going to happen at any moment now.
Right, but Russia has said in response to that, they said, we're not in default. We've got upwards of 300 billion in those countries where those debts are, and in that country, or those countries where those debts are due. Well, you can just take them. Just take them. What do you mean we're in default? That's not a default. It's only a default when I actually can't pay you. If you've stolen my money, if you've taken my money, you admit and recognize and state that it's there, but I'm not allowed to use it. Okay, I don't want to use it. You use it. Pay yourself. Go ahead. And if you don't want to pay in the currency that that the debts are to be repaid in, like dollars, because America says somebody says we're not going to accept that, I'm not going to take payment. It's a weird situation where you owe me money, and you say there's the money over there, and I say no, I'm not taking that money. It's perfectly good money, you tell me, and I say no, I don't want it because he says I can't use it. Some bullshit like that, basically. That's what sanctions is, But in terms of those reserves are made up of different currencies. So they have some. We don't know the exact amounts, but some of it's in yuan, or the Russians have also said you can pay you back in rubles or whatever you want. But like, there's plenty of money. Just tell me what you want. You don't want dollars? You can't use dollars because America will be mean to you. I'll give it in rubles. I'll give it in yuan. What do you want? Sterling. So I think it was kind of actually a smart move to continue to avoid the claim that they've actually defaulted on any of their debts, to keep that money in the place where it's traditionally used to repay Russia's debts. It's right there. Take it. Just because you say you froze it doesn't mean it's not available. It doesn't make it disappear just because you froze it.
And Biden just showed last month that they will and can use the foreign debts of another country, which they just did with Afghanistan.
For sure,
what we're going to do is we're going to give half of it back to you.
Yeah.
Afghanistan, which is trying to stave off a famine right now. And the other half, we're going to pay to the victims of 9/11, the families, the surviving family members.
Yeah. So I think it was actually a smart move. There's all sorts of stuff about, what did the Russian central bank do, leaving those half of their, foreign exchange reserves in other countries where there could be sanctions. And I think it was
I doubt it was an oversight.
It was actually, no, I doubt it. And it was a kind of smart move. And it means that Russia has the other half within Russia, and it can use that to the primary, or one of the main things it would use that to do would be
to main trade with the rest.
Well, no, to prop up the ruble, because they want to be able to keep their currency kind of afloat as it kind of tanks a little bit because of all the sanction business, because they attack on the currency basically. The way a government offsets that is basically buying their own currency in order to keep it afloat, to prop it up, to stop it tanking completely. So the reserves they have within Russia can be used for that, and then for foreign debt, we'll use our foreign exchange reserves that are in the Bank of England or in the Bank of Paris or Bank of France, whatever. So yeah, and that's what I mean. There seems to be a real lack of teeth about these sanctions. You know what I mean? I know they're trying hard, and at least in different ways, but I don't think they're that serious about it because they know there's some mechanism, and I'm not an economist and I don't know enough about it, but there's some mechanism where when you, like in France, there's 70 billion of Russia's foreign exchange reserves are in France. 70
some
billion.
Of it's cash, some of it's gold. Whatever.
What does France do with that? Do you know what I mean? Does it just remove it? That's what I couldn't figure. I couldn't find out if countries that hold those foreign exchange reserves or other countries can use them themselves in some way or other, or if they're kind of like sacrosanct or something like that. I don't know, but there's...
Oh, I think it is sacrosanct until now, because one of the statements from the Russians since this was announced was Right. Well, there you go. You've just proven that the whole Western system is geared towards
Thievery.
whatever Uncle Sam says
Right.
is what goes. Otherwise, we take it.
Mm.
So thanks for proving our point. We're now going to build an alternative system or continue push in that direction anyway.
Yeah.
Starting with us in China.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that it's almost like we needed the proof. Not
Yeah.
so much we knew ourselves, but to
For
show
the
our
world.
population and everyone else. You
Yeah.
have just given us the perfect lesson in why the petrodollar system is gone.
Yeah.
Forget it. We cannot rely on it because you flouted the key sacrosanct rule of international business.
Yeah.
So
Throw up the McD JPEG, Scotty, just an example of McDonald's closed, as you may have heard, They had 847 restaurants in
this.
Russia. So the Russians turned the logo 90 degrees and called it Uncle Vanya, which is B. And that's a patent for the registration of the trademark of just turning the golden arches 90 degrees and calling it Uncle Vanya, and then keeping all of McDonald's 847 restaurants open under that logo.
that in that case, then they are nationalized. They are taking.
But you walk away from it. What are you going to do? Like, and if you've taken your foreign exchange reserves, and you're not going to tell us whether we can use them or not, or whether other people can use them to facilitate to resolve the debt. I mean, until you make it clear what you're doing with our $300 billion, we're taking your McDonald's.
They also said that those McDonald's will use only Russian products.
Yeah.
So it'll be 100%. It'll be a Russian.
Let's
That do you know what that breaks? Another sacrosanct rule, which is intellectual property rights. But like Russia's like, well, if you break this foundational international, well, we're going to break
Yeah,
this one.
you're breaking it all. You're breaking the rules-based international order. Isn't that what they stand for, America? The rules-based international order. But you break the rules whenever you want. So talk to us about China there. Tell us all about China. People want to know about China. What's going on with China? Is China evil? Are they the Chicoms? Are they going to take over America? Or what are they doing vis-a-vis Russia and this whole situation? Who are they aligned with? Are they on their own? Are they a wild card? Are they just going to stab everybody in the back? Or are they actually aligned with Russia? And are they going to, stand with Russia against this Western attack on, the rest of the world, basically? And just on that point, before you answer, you have to think about that, but on that point about the UN, you heard about the UN recently where they had a vote to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. And it was China abstained, and Syria and a couple other countries. Only 3 or 4 countries abstained, and all the rest of them, or was it? I can't remember, but only 3 or 4 voted against. A bunch abstained, and a lot agreed with. So 4 countries said no. China. Did China say no? Anyway, that's not my point. The point is that's a bogus representation of what's going on. It's again Western media propaganda, not telling the full story. What you really need to do is look at countries to get a feel for what other countries in the world really feel about Russia and Ukraine. You look at the ones who are imposing sanctions and the ones who aren't. The ones who are not imposing sanctions, regardless of what way they voted in the UN, is China, India, Turkey, Brazil, and quite a few other, maybe another dozen different countries who have said, Mexico I think is one of them, not doing the sanctions thing. But if you add up China and India, that's about, it's maybe 2/5. Well, it's not far off half the world's population. If you include Russia, basically, if you include the countries that aren't sanctioning Russia and therefore tacitly approve or don't really mind that what they're doing in Ukraine, you get to about half the world's population or a bit more. But if you look at it on a list of countries, it looks very bad for Russia, right? All these countries are either condemning it or abstaining, and only a few are agreeing. But the ones that aren't sanctioning it and they're going to continue to have do business as normal with Russia, which obviously facilitates, Russia to continue to be, to continue this push, what appears to be a push to create a parallel or an alternative global economy that's, not exclusively in the east of Europe, but certainly a big chunk of it is in the east when you consider the economic and population size in terms of China and India. But there's also Brazil down in South America and stuff. But yeah, it's
The West versus the rest.
yeah. You know, I mean, but my point is that Russia can see the way seems open for them to successfully continue to sustain their economy and engage in trade, global trade, just not necessarily with America or European countries, as long as they decide that's what they want to do. But there's plenty of other people in the world that Russia already has strong partnerships with, and has a strong trade agreements and strong trade with. So the idea that they're going to take Russia down, destroy it through their sanctions, it's talked up so much, but it doesn't have a lot of teeth or a lot of...
No, it's pathetic. Last week, India announced they would buy 3 million barrels of crude from Russia.
Yeah.
And the White House press secretary, Jen, God help us all, Psaki, when asked about that, does the White House have any comment, said something like, well, you know, India probably wants to think about its place in history, you know, how it looks, that kind of stuff.
How it looks to who?
Like this is an Instagram moment, you know, and that's the superficial trumps the reality of trade and war and peace, you know, the hard strategic decisions that a leader like Modi makes when he goes to do business with Putin. As if the optics, you know, that's the Western projection of our time, where optics are everything.
Yep.
And reality is just a nebulous thing, you know, that can be undone with a couple of weeks of intense media campaigning.
Reality is something we create through perception and through propaganda.
That's all they have left.
And many people are falling for it, but if you look behind the scenes, you find it's the great and terrible Oz. You know, i.e. that little guy pulling the levers behind the curtain, not the big scary image on the screen, you know. Yeah, so...
Can you put up the last link I sent you? I just want to look at the chart at the top of this. The 2,000 years of economic history in one chart. Just scroll down a little bit more so we can see the key there. So, okay, sorry, go up a little. So, yeah, 2,000 years, one chart. This shows, depending on what definition they use, whatever, GDP of all major powers over time, over 2,000 years. Now, they've crunched the first millennium there from 1 to 1,000. If you look at the bottom, it's just that first space. So it's not actually a time representative chart. It takes key moments in world events and plots the more or less GDP share of each major country in the world over time. Also, of course, as we know, that there's probably 500 years that don't exist there in the first millennium. But anyway, because that includes the Dark Ages. But you see there, look at this state of the world from 1 AD through to 1700, 1820 even. India, in fact, was larger than China.
Yeah.
For much of that. They were the power. That's where, quote unquote, hegemony resided. South and East Asia. For the longest time. It only changes when you see the two blues, United States and United Kingdom, come online. First, Britain, of course, Industrial Revolution, and other Western European powers. And it warps. The whole shape of it changes. They come to dominate global GDP. Mm-hmm. That peak of the two blues, together with France, is 1950. So they all Western European countries, and then the US after a civil war,
Germany, Italy, and Spain,
ride the wave, the objective wave. It's not so much theirs. It's not they still claim it, like we saw with that Telegraph guy. Oh, the modern world we create. Well, you rode a wave of something. That's a coincidence of factors, in my opinion. But anyway, so that's the Industrial Revolution, and they rise up. And the very peak of it is just after World War II. You see there, 1940, 1950 peak. That was the unipolar moment, because everything from then on is the decline in the GDP share of Western countries. They maintained, altogether, if you include Russia. If you exclude Russia, you see there, Germany is the last Western country. So they at least since 2000, after which there's a drop off, their share of global GDP is 50%, is half. Now it's smaller. 2017 is the last date they give, and you can see there on the top, China is almost back at the kind of level it had 1,000 years ago. 1,000 and even less, 500 years ago. I've seen other analyses as well that China's GDP growth percentage of the world trade was still slightly higher than what it is today, just before the Opium Wars with Britain in the 1830s and 40s. It was is known at the time as the economic powerhouse of the world. One of the quirks of history that created this huge mountain of the share of Western GDP in the world in our relatively modern time is partly because Europeans, one of their motivations for breaking out of Europe was because they were trying hard to find hard currency, gold, silver. The Spanish and the Portuguese in the Americas, their obsession with gold and silver. Why was that? Well, obviously, it's valuable in itself, but why? What was the specific need for it? They were having a trade issue with China. China and India would only settle for hard currency. Well, why is that? Why couldn't they just trade goods? Because they would bring their goods over, the Portuguese, to India, and then later the Spanish, and then the Dutch East Indies. And the people over there were like, really, the quality of your stuff. So you've got some wool stuff. Oh, that's interesting. You've got some new technologies. We haven't seen this version of the compass before. Well, interesting. Oh, that's a printer to make paper. Well, we actually have a printer too, but yours is interesting. Yeah, but you know what? We really want hard currency from you.
Yeah.
And that was an enormous driver of the need to get hard currency to settle trade with the Eastern countries, because they weren't impressed by what Europeans had to offer.
They have it all themselves and better. Yeah.
And you then come forward a little in time, and the British were like, no.
Let's take them out.
Let's do something about this. And said, you're going to accept opium as currency trade for tea, and the whole Opium War started. And that was the beginning of China's disgrace, as they see it themselves, a century of humiliation. I think it's so hard. It's hard for us to conceive of it because we're born into a world that appeared to be like this forever. But in fact, as you see, this is really only a moment in time.
Yeah.
The real, it's a bit like interstitial
Cystitis.
Ice Age.
Yeah,
You know,
sorry.
the default is actually the world is predominantly in Ice Age conditions. Most of Europe and most of North America is under miles of ice most of the time. We happen to be living and flourishing in a time where there's a melt. It's similar with the global, the balance of power globally. So it's going back to the East anyway. You see there's a natural ongoing process afoot. It's just being instrumentalized more now that China, in their case, has a very cohesive government, a very cohesive society around an ideology that is indeed partly, in large part, communist officially. But as Xi Jinping says nowadays, it's communism, with Chinese characteristics, which is really to say we're dropping a lot of the kind of crazy Cultural Revolution stuff and we're bringing back our history. We're trying to... That's an important point that I can't really gauge the extent to which this process has taken place in China, except through its movies. It's been making a lot of films. It's got a burgeoning movie industry, especially with historical films. There's a freaking hunger in China for information about, you know, the old periods, the Qing dynasty, the Ming dynasty, even the dynasty where the Mongols ruled, and then going back before that, the Sung dynasty was super powerful. All the way back to the Three Kingdoms and the Han Dynasty. So
it's the rise of nationalism.
It's the rise of and the process of getting to that is to reconnect with your history, to get to go into history, to get an objective picture of who we are and where we came from. To use that to inform policy today. Look at Putin, for God's sake. The man is a man of history. I don't just mean what he's doing. There's a certain English philosopher, actually, not well known. He should have been because he was brilliant. Robin Collingwood. And he describes, he saw history as the true science of human nature. And part of what he meant by that was that to get a true insight into who you are, and this can be scaled out into who we are as a tribe and into who we are as a country, and who we are as a Western civilization. It's all scalable. The way to do that is you must have a true understanding of your history.
Yeah.
And for that, you must have the courage to not believe a lot of the assumptions you've been raised with.
Yeah.
Because you will find, if you are genuinely sincere about going into history, that much of it is dross, it's false, it's misunderstood, it's bullshit.
mythos,
in fact, it's mythos. And the only way, the process of doing that is to build insight into oneself, how one thinks, why one thinks that way, and so on. And this, then it can be mapped out. Anyway, the way it relates here is that Collingwood said that the man who goes into history, if he asks the right questions and he does it honestly, he can come out with he didn't say perfect, but the objective solutions to problems he faces today. Putin is obsessed with history. He the stuff that we all heard him say in the more recent speeches, that thing, for example, that last quip just before he said, and so I have declared a special
military
operation in Ukraine. The last thing he said, almost with a grin on his face, was, so you want the decommunization of Ukraine. Well, as he just explained in the last preceding 10 minutes, your country, Ukraine, was put together by communists, the early Bolsheviks, Lenin, that idiot, and others after him, all the way up to, not Brezhnev, the guy before him, when they stitched together parts to create the Soviet Republic of the Ukraine. So I will help you decommunize this country.
As the inheritors of that tradition and the new Russia, I will help you decommunize, yeah.
That was taken as, oh God, he's gone full Tonto, to quote Ben Wallace, the British Minister of Defence. Yeah, he's just lost it. He's just going to take all of Ukraine. Actually, the man has written an extensive article, which Wallace knows about, actually, that was published on the Kremlin website last year. It's unbelievable because it's like in a history of Ukraine, as Russia sees it, indeed. But you get the impression he's trying to be objective, because part of what he says in it is that Ukraine was, in its current modern form, was created by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. And he has reasons for why they did it. And one of the crazy claims in that article is that Lenin was in contact with American advisors directly connected with the Woodrow Wilson White House. Mm-hmm. They worked out this plan together. This was such an outrageous claim that he had in his article that the very anti-Putin outlet in Russia itself,
Moscow,
not Moscow Times, although they're pretty anti-Putin, Medusa.io. I think they've just been banned in Russia or something like that because they're so flagrantly anti-Putin. But anyway, last year they said, well, this is going to be easy to debunk. So they fact-checked his article. And they said, let's go for the most ludicrous claim, this thing about Lenin cooperating with Woodrow Wilson to further dismember Russia and create this country called Ukraine. Lo and behold, in fairness to them, and they published it, the claim is true. Mm-hmm. The claim is true. So Putin has gone into history to find a solution. Obviously, there's kind of more to it than that. You cannot just have objective. You've also got to have your pulse on what the peoples who are going to be affected by it are thinking. I think he has hit the jackpot. We'll see. I could be wrong. We'll see. There's been some resistance in Ukraine, but as you've noted on the show, there's very little. There are no mass protests against Putin. There's no mass uprising like we saw in Turkey in 2016, where people were throwing themselves under the tanks of the people who were organizing the coup against Erdogan. 250, 300 people sacrificed themselves to stun the anti-Erdogan people in the military who were trying to overthrow, and they just they were overrun. They got off the tanks and they ripped them out of the tanks. Yeah. You're not seeing any of that in Ukraine.
No, another example is Yugoslavia, and when NATO bombed Yugoslavia, bombed Belgrade in 99, the people of Belgrade, by the thousands, all stood on bridges in Belgrade and in other cities in Serbia, in Yugoslavia, to stop NATO bombing them.
Yeah.
They put themselves there as human shields.
Yeah.
You don't see that in Ukraine, you know, and it's obvious why that's not happening, because there's a lot of divided loyalties in Ukraine. That's the complexity of it, and it exposes the bullshit of the Western media, how they're trying to say, you know, Ukrainian people united in their resistance against the Russian invasion. That's just simply not true. It's simply not true. You go and look at Wikipedia, and like we did on the show a couple of weeks ago, we look up at the amount of people who speak Russia, who claim in surveys have claimed they speak Russian in Ukraine, and the significant majority, if the significant majority speak it on a daily basis, and those who don't understand it, and that's just one aspect of the cultural ties between Ukraine and Russia. So and there's many more. You know, they share a common culture. There are people who have relatives. Many people in Ukraine have relatives in Russia, and obviously vice versa. So the idea that, you know, there's a lot of ambivalence in the Ukrainian population towards this invasion, and they're not happy with their government. You know what I mean? They haven't been for quite a long time. It's been, most Ukrainian governments for the past 20 years have been quite corrupt. And a lot of Ukrainian people see this Russian invasion as for what it's stated, or for what the Russians state it to be, which is an attempt to remove elements within the Russian or within the Ukrainian political and military establishments who are rabidly anti-Russian and who are working directly with America hand in hand to try and create problems and threats to Russia. And no country in the world would sit by and allow that to happen. And Russia tried to resolve it amicably for the past 10 years almost, and America blocked them at every opportunity, because they wanted to see they wanted to make happen what is happening right now. They wanted to force Russia to take military action, because they could use it to smear Russia.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it in a nutshell. And you will not hear that anywhere in the Western press, which is ridiculous, because it's self-evidently true.
Yeah. You asked me about China, so,
so
we
let's
ended
go
up
back to
coming
China.
back to Russia. But I think part of the reason why we will end up doing that is because, as I see it, indeed, it's a simple yes to your answer. They are strategically aligned in the sense that China agrees with this. China supports this tacitly and increasingly more overtly. There's a kind of a part of the reason that, well, it's not the reason all eyes are on Russia, from Washington to ours, everywhere, the whole world, is because I think Russia is a bit like the tip of a spear, but that spear is largely Chinese. And I think Putin accepts that. He has no choice but to. The population of China is about 10 times the size of Russia's. I think China. Okay, and a separate issue is it a good thing? No one knows. No one in the West knows. We have lived experience now of Putin's interventions being good. So let's run through them. Okay, first one is Chechnya. The horrible situation there with terrorists / and some of them were indeed independence fighters. There was an independence movement, plus there was Islamic terrorism. They were encouraged by the CIA and the MI6 and Mossad to do what they were doing in the 1990s. Putin takes charge of that in 1999, becomes president in 2000, and deals with the problem. He does a famous speech where he's like, we're going to hit them in the shithouse, in the toilets, wherever they are, we're going to whack them. And he's angry Putin. The world saw angry Putin first time, and he did it. Okay, so how's that a good thing? He just killed a lot of people. Well, he completely rebuilt Chechnya, gave it autonomy, to the point that the Kadyrov brigades that are fighting in Ukraine right now have their own. They're obviously answering in some way to the Russian military, but they're actually formally a militia. They're answerable officially to Kadyrov, not to the Russian regular forces. Anyway, so they have autonomy, they have been rebuilt, and it's stable, and everyone's happy with it. So you see what I mean? He put out a fire. The proof is in what he did being objectively good for them, those people, for Russia as a whole, and therefore for the world. Universally, it's a good thing. The second thing then is Georgia in 2008, We know what that was. That was, in fact, an antagonism. It was a provocation by that nut job, Saakashvili, against Russia. And he smacked him. And because of internal issues of ethnic Russians in Georgia, he recognized the independence, i.e. put his paw down, Russian bear paw down, and said, you won't be mistreating the people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And he left it at that. He didn't try and incorporate them into Russia. But Georgia has been, that fire has more or less been dealt with. Okay. Then the next one is, well, obviously there's Crimea. That will, of course, it still is interpreted as, well, he just wanted to take, but whatever. He did objectively prevent all the other shit that happened in Ukraine happening in Crimea. Everyone at least agrees with that. They haven't been bombed or terrorized by Kiev. Okay. Then the next one immediately after that is ISIS. Fire starts there. He comes in and he says, we're going to deal with this. First he goes to the UN in New York and he says, do you realize what you've done? Next day, Russia starts bombing. Caliber cruise missiles rain down from Caspian Sea, from the Mediterranean. The whole world's like, holy shit, what the hell? That's amazing. And then the fire is more or less put out within 6 months. Obviously, it's still ongoing, but
yeah, it was put out.
Assad is still there because yesterday he just made his first visit to an Arab country, to the UAE. He's still the president, and Syria is stabilized. And the terrorism, the ISIS attacks in Europe just went off a cliff. Okay? So, objectively good at every count, whenever there's action taken. What we don't know yet is if Chinese military actions will be objectively good. I think it's a good bet that they will be.
Yeah.
Because they have supported Russia at every step of the way along these. They've always been on their side. They've never been antagonistic, at least.
Yeah, I think what people want to know about China is that you need to address the fears that people in the West have about China and the propaganda, the messaging they get about China, that it's a one-party state, that it's the universal, what do you call it, the not universal basic income, but the checks they have on your credit score, basically the credit score system and all that kind of stuff, and that it's a totalitarian state, and that when China takes over the world, they're going to impose that on the rest of the world. That's pretty much what people say about China, especially in America. The Chinese commies, they're basically commies, and they're going to take over the world and impose communism on the rest of the world.
Well, they have not once ever done a trade deal or issued a loan with conditions. They have not once attempted regime change in another country. They have not once jumped on the bandwagon of an undergoing regime change operation by the Western countries.
Yeah.
They have a very consistent record on that. In the West, it's such an inbuilt thing that it's euphemistically called structural conditions by the freaking IMF. Here's the loan. You got to change this and this and this and this and this and this and this.
You got to privatize your economy. Your
China doesn't do that. There are no strings attached, except the ones you would normally expect. Like, please don't, antagonize us about. Well, in fact, they are explicit about this. I will admit that. Don't bring up the Uyghurs. Don't bring up Hong Kong. And just generally don't piss us off, okay? And we'll do trade. The social credit score, that's been debunked really well. And it's been debunked in the image of it of being as totalitarian as people fear it is. By that Canadian guy in Canada, in Shanghai, Mark or Dan Dumbrell, among others. They're English-speaking observers who've lived in China, and they discuss it and they go through what is actually being rolled out and processed. So basically, now I'm not going to go any further than that, and actually defend it as a good thing, because we're in this great unknown at the moment, this murky period where, and I do sympathize with people who fear China for their social credit score system, because it does look like in the West the elements of it are being functionally rolled out as a equivalent for social credit score system, and that it is inspired by China doing. I don't disagree with that, but the subtlety that may make all the difference is that the intention and the specific outcomes that each of the two sides, China over here in the east and the West over here via Facebook and all of them together, really, they're all one Borg as far as I'm concerned at this point, doing what they're doing is that they're for different reasons. Some small examples that we know for sure about China. Number one, porn is banned in China. Officially. I know everyone can watch porn in China if they want to, but it's not easy to. You got to get your VPN. You got to avoid this. You got to do that. You can watch it, and you can find a prostitute. Yeah, sure, but officially you can't. There are, loosely speaking, controls in place to stop you doing it, which disincentivizes you, and that's all. They don't, if they catch you on Pornhub, come round your house and beat the shit out of you. Of course not. They could be arse with that. But there's a deterrence in place. Now, is it objectively good one way or the other? The proof will be in the pudding of, well, how is this society doing versus how is that society doing?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's nonsense, and I think China's just used as a foil for the West wanting to impose these. I mean, look what they did over COVID and all that kind of stuff. You know, and you can't blame China on COVID if you know the likely reality of it. I mean, what Western governments did to the populations in terms of lockdowns and all those restrictions that were just psychopathic, basically, under cover of public health. The West has its own, Western governments, in particular the US and Western governments, have their own plan to tighten controls around the population that they're fully behind themselves and implementing. And they people in the West who see that happening because they can never look at themselves and look at their own government. A lot of people, particularly in America and in Europe, can't look at their own governments and see the evil within their own governments. They have to project it onto somebody else, and they project it onto China because China's communist and China wants to control its population and blah 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 blah. So, and I don't see any reason to think that China is going to try and do what America has been doing for the past 100 years, basically. Like you were just saying, they've never invaded it. They don't have that within them. They don't have, at the minute anyway, they don't have that mentality. And certainly it would be difficult when they're in an alliance with Russia. You know what I mean? If there is an alliance right now. I mean, the Chinese said recently that their relationship with Russia is more than allies. You know, I mean, that's going pretty far for the Chinese to come out and make that statement, and they've been pretty clear about their intentions over in terms of sanctioning. And it's like take your sanctions and take a hike. Basically, it's nonsense. You know, I put up that tweet I just sent you, Scotty, as an example. This is Liu Jin, is one of China's most famous news anchors, and she summed up yesterday's Sino-US talks, which was with Blinken, and I think Blinken went over but there was a bunch of them went over to try and get China to play ball the American way, and she summed it up with, "Can you help me fight your friend so that I can concentrate on fighting you later?" Which is pretty much an example of you know, I mean, if she's one of the main, you know, best known news anchors and stuff, she's saying that as a reflection of what the Chinese government thinks, and probably what a lot of Chinese people think. You know, so they're not fooled by America's bullshit. And America's got some balls like on it to come and try and do that. They did the same thing in Venezuela, as you know. And in Venezuela, after calling, you know, basically delegitimizing a democratically elected government and of what do you call him in Venezuela, Maduro,
with the
and shooing in Guaido,
random guy Guaido,
and claiming random Guaido. Like, I mean, you can't get any more. You can't delegitimize a country any more than making that statement. And then they turn around and go down and ask for, or at least have some talks about possibly lifting sanctions so we can buy your oil again. They've got serious hubris, like, you know.
But this hubris has characterized the whole trajectory of Western history since the 1800s.
Yeah.
The only difference now with, say, the triple entente that the British crafted just prior to World War One is that it's happening so fast now that they're trying hard to keep up. The Americans would see that and go, well, yeah, it's a dog-eat-dog world, so of course I've closed the sanctions on Venezuela tomorrow. They're my ally, and then I use them against... I mean, that's the way it's always been. Because think back in history. The British create the triple entente of Russia, France, and Britain to contain a rising German industrialization that led to World War One. I was looking at, from my perspective now, back in history and going, how the hell did these people fall into that? Well, enough time passed between, say, the Crimean War, when Britain, France, and Turkey, then Ottoman Empire, ganged up on Russia. And there's enough decades passed and enough things shift around in a slightly larger passage of time that you can hoodwink the Russians into joining your cause now. Joining a cause, ironically, which caused them the bloody Bolshevik Revolution and all the devastation they've had since. But now, with all of that behind us, Russia and China have this knowledge of history, and they won't be making the same mistakes. And the US and other allies are forced to do it faster and faster.
Yeah.
It was January 2019 when random guy Guaido was the legitimate and Maduro. And it's like, okay, now we close the sanctions on Russia. Oh, Venezuela, no, let's bring it in. Okay, send an envoy over. We'll re-legitimize him and everything will be fine. And like Maduro's sitting there going, guys, barely any time has passed. And they're like, well, no, this is international. This is the way it's always been. And it is the way it's always been. But it's entering absurdityville because it's sped up. And it's whack-a-mole that they can no longer keep up with.
Right.
Against enemies, because the whole world is their enemy, that is no longer fooled.
If in the new reality, in the new world order, as the title of the show is, China is kind of reign supreme, like, or China is the top dog, like, there's no reason to think that China will do what America does. First of all, because it's not America, they're not Americans, they're Chinese, and they've no history of doing that. And secondly, well, you could say, well, when they have the power, they might do it. But it's a totally different, the geography of it plays into it, you know? America's over there, at least from most of the rest of the world, which is like the Eurasian landmass. It's over there in splendid isolation, and it went around the world bombing and conquering because it needed to, right? Because it was separated from most of the world's resources, and it wanted them, whether it needed them or not, it wanted them. So it had to fly off and build 10 aircraft carriers in order to facilitate this military domination of, a lot of different places in the world. But if you look at China, if there's a new world order developing that's centered on Eurasia with China in the top seat, it's going to be forged out of partnerships that are being developed right now against the old world order, which was America and the West reigning supreme. And there's not really a scope there. It doesn't follow naturally that China would then suddenly start to dominate and invade every other country in Eurasia. You know what I mean? What's going to invade India with 1.3 billion people? I mean, there's more than 5 billion people on the Eurasian landmass, which is 3/5 or more of the world's population, and most of its resources. And if there's a new, as the Chinese plan, the whole Eurasian kind of Belt and Road initiative, if there's a new kind of world order taking shape right now, on the basis of, like I said, it's on the basis of cooperation, and China needs to cooperate, and they'll be developing friendly ties, and there's no reason in that situation for any country, especially on a contiguous landmass, to go and decide, okay, now I'm going to invade all the people that I just made, that I just created a new kind of economic system or a new world in a certain sense with, you know what I mean? And more to the point, I don't think we can, you know what I mean? There's 5 billion people here and we're 1.5, I mean, it's all just speculation, and it's all based on the idea of what people understand America having done, or the Atlanticists or the Anglo-American clique having done over the past 100 years. That's what they project onto others, and they can't understand that others might not be so inclined.
Yeah. No, the Chinese, the character of their rise has been the opposite of what that broadcaster just said. So she summarized the kind of dog-eat-dog mentality. So you want me to now smack my friend so that you can smack me later. Okay, right, get it. The Chinese one is summed up by their own mantra. What about win-win cooperation? How about if we trade with you, America, and we trade with Russia, and we trade with Ukraine? Why not? Long-term, all things being equal, that wins. It's so much more stable. It's actually unbeatable. And one of the military aspects of all this, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, has been key to Russia getting the green light, so to speak. I don't ever remember this being articulated. But the fact is, India, in that scenario of a future clash of civilization between China and India, it can't happen. Because India under the nose of the Chinese, i.e., with no pushback or what are you doing from Beijing, Moscow sold them S-400s. India has total air cover.
Yeah, yeah.
It cannot be attacked. And Beijing wants it that way. Good, you're locked in. And now Turkey has the S-400s. Good, you're locked in. They all mutually want mutually assured destruction, so to speak, because then that ends it.
Yeah.
There can be no hegemon. They're trying, it's almost like they're consciously trying to create a scenario where there can be no hegemon.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. And I think, Americans can take hope or take heart in the fact that in Europeans, NATO heads take heart in the fact that it's very likely that, China and Russia will be magnanimous in victory. There'll be no reprisals necessarily. They're only too willing to, once they've kind of, pushed America back enough that it accepts its rightful place in the world, albeit after a few eggs are broken, as you have to when you're making an omelette. There'll be no long-standing grievances. They won't turn them into a pariah of the world. You know what I mean? If that happens, you can be fairly confident that they'll be willing to see you again as their partners type thing. And that's unlike Ukraine, because there's going to be no magnanimity, is it? Or magnanimousness? I don't know. Anyway, they won't be magnanimous in defeat. And they're certainly not. They're on the road to defeat.
I don't think the US will be either.
No, but they won't have much to do.
The US in its current form.
But in the process right now, Ukraine is not being magnanimous in what is clearly an approaching defeat.
Yeah.
They're going down to the last man, to the last civilian, basically. I mean, they throw up the 12 MP4. This is, we played a couple weeks ago the Paris one, where the Ukrainian Ministry of Propaganda put out a simulated, video of them bombing the Eiffel Tower and stuff. And imagine this was happening to you as a propaganda to try and get the French people to think this is what it's like in Ukraine. Well, this could happen to Paris any moment now because of Putin.
Yeah.
Well, they did another one for Germany, just to follow on. Brandenburg. Just imagine. Close your eyes and see it happen. The war is getting closer.
The Russians
Ukraine is fighting for our values. Stop Russian aggression.
Yeah.
So that's kind of bullshit that they're coming out with, which is designed to keep the flow of, anti-tank, manpad and other weapons coming to Ukraine from European countries and from America, so that Russia's inevitable accomplishment of their plans in Ukraine, which, as we've stated, is getting rid of the rabid anti-Russian element within the government and within the military, which is fairly pervasive, and just letting Ukraine then be a normal neighbor country of Russia. They're trying to slow that, trying to stop that from happening, and in the process ensure that as many civilians are killed as possible, because it's very clear that Russia has no malintent towards the Ukrainian people. The Russian government, Putin himself, sees them as as kind of one family, brothers and all that kind of stuff. They just want to get rid of the rabid anti-Russian, which have been there for a long time, and they've really institutionalized that anti-Russian rhetoric and anti-Russian belief and attitude in as many people in Ukraine as possible. And I mean, how would you expect to live? You know what I mean? What mentality?
Israel.
Yeah, but
It's similar, no?
yeah, except you're not the same people.
whole world
At
hates
least you're
us.
not the same people. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you can't even do it internally. It'd be more like as if Israel was populated by Arabs only. If Jews were Arabs, basically, you know what I mean? But you just took a bizarrely anti-Arab stance against your Arab brothers type thing and decided to set yourself apart from all of them. I mean, but Israel is only a close approximation, but it's even worse in Ukraine, where they're basically the same people, shared history, shared culture, shared language, and they want to institute into schools, anti-Russian rhetoric in textbooks, in songs,
they want
banning the Russian
genocide.
language,
De-Russification.
booting out anybody who wanted to be Russian or any kind of have any affiliation with Russian. Will go to Russia then. I mean, they're basically kicking people out of the country. That's not Western values.
Oh,
So why is it?
I dispute that.
Well, not officially. It's not officially on the table. They're
There is
officially
a
on the
long
table.
history of Russophobia. The Russians are coming.
No,
has
it's
been
not Russian. It's not Western values. It's not. It's not part of Western values to say, if you don't like America, get out of our country. If you don't, if you want to speak a different language, get out of our country. America doesn't kick out Hispanics.
right.
America doesn't kick out African Americans because they say, well, I feel like I'm African, or I feel like I'm Hispanic. That's what the Ukrainians have been doing. If you feel like you're Russian, if you want to speak the Russian language, if you want to celebrate some Russian cultural aspects, go to Russia.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they expected that to go fine. Well, yeah, with the backing of NATO, with the backing of America, because America wants to screw Russia over at every opportunity, and will use Ukraine to screw you over by encouraging this nutbag, radical, anti-Russian clique in the government and in the military.
Yeah.
And the cult and in society.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And they'll use the trope, the Russians are coming. As we're still there, the war is coming. They're coming to Berlin. They're coming to Paris.
Yeah.
Because it is an old, it's so old you wouldn't believe. This goes back to like Peter the Great. There was a long-standing conspiracy theory where Peter the Great supposedly died and left a will. And in his will, he stipulated that his successors must take over all of Europe. And it was as false as, it's worse, in fact. But anyway, it's as false as the Protocols of Zion. It was a forgery. And it was proven as a forgery about 150 years later. But it was actually held up as a key document informing Western European policy vis-a-vis Russia for 150 years.
Hmm.
And then that kind of segues into, the Cold War period. The Russians are coming, this time because they're Soviets, right?
mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's a really old, and it's an old fear. It's unfounded. The Russians did once send the military actually to Paris to end the Napoleonic Wars. The Tsar Alexander I arrived in Russia with his alliance, arrived in Paris on horseback with his alliance, formally ending Napoleonic Wars. And resetting the balance of power in Europe, which had been obviously a war non-stop since the French Revolution. And it ushered in a century of stability, more or less, in Western Europe. So the Russians have come. The Russians do come. The Russians are coming today. But it's to smack all the errant children and to say, look, this is a playground. But once you start, chucking the missiles at us, we have to draw the line. So we're putting you all back in place.
yeah,
That's the history. That's the objective history of Russia's involvement with the West.
Let's have a last word from Zelensky, because he's the man. He's holding up in Kiev, as you can see here. Last man standing. He'll go down with the ship, right? Actually, there's no words on this, and it's only 3 seconds.
He's
But
wearing a jumpsuit.
Tell me what you think there. Just play it.
Добрий вечір всім.
Oh, there's some words.
Play it again.
Play it again. Play it a few times.
Добрий вечір всім.
Something's not right about his makeup.
Добрий вечір
I'm
всім.
not right about that background.
It's the lighting. Yeah, hang on a
Добрий
second.
вечір всім.
There's something wrong with that. I don't think he's actually in
He's
that
not
play.
there.
That's a green screen. But if he's in Kiev,
Why
going
would he
down with
need
a
a
ship,
green
why
screen?
does he need a green screen? Surely he should just show the bunker he's in, holding out with all the...
Добрий вечір всім.
I wonder where he is. It's like where's Wally? Where's Zelly?
Maybe he's gone.
Where's Zelly?
He's gone back into acting, and
Is
this
he
is part of
is
a
he-
new series.
Maybe he's in Paris, or maybe he's in Berlin, or maybe he's in London, or maybe he's in Washington, D.C. Who knows? But as far as the media is concerned, he's in Kiev with his AK-47, waiting to see the whites of the eyes of the Russians. He's going to be the last man standing. You better believe it. That's the kind of bullshit we have to deal with, folks. Luckily, you don't have to deal with that kind of bullshit here. We de-bullshitify as much as we possibly can. Certainly the stuff you've been subjected to over the past 3 weeks now, or more, and even longer, obviously. So I think we'll leave it there. We've gone more than 2 hours, and people are probably getting tired. Did we have any interesting? Probably not. You would have brought them up, right? Any questions? We just generalized chatting in the chat room. But yeah, so thanks for listening, guys. Thanks for chatting. Don't forget to like, subscribe, smash all the buttons. We'll be back next week with another show on whatever's been happening between now and then, which will probably be lots. And we'll see you then. So until then, have a good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are.
Thanks for watching.
See
Bye.
ya.
Can't stop the signal now.